May the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, and the actions of our lives be ever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. One of our parish nurses, our sainted parish nurses, Catherine Lyon, also works as a nurse and advocate for persons living with ALS, which you may know is a debilitating disease of increasing paralysis that made infamous through the suffering of Lou Gehrig and Stephen Hawking, and sometimes even among our friends. Well, a couple of years ago, one of her clients asked about healing touch and prayer, which is how I came to meet him. Brad was barely in his 30s when his mobility was already significantly compromised, although he could still hold his children, tell a good story, laugh, and with a little help from his friends, go out for a beer. Over the next several months, we would practice the prayer of healing touch, which is sharing an awareness of Christ's healing presence through gentle touch and quiet vigil. The apparent effects of healing touch vary from person to person, although it nearly always reduces anxiety and promotes a sense of well-being. For Brad, it did those things, but it became a practice of letting go, a practice of many little deaths. We would talk a bit, pray, and then with that first lightest touch, he would release a long breath, sink into his chair, and drift along on a raft of divine love. His rigid body would feel weightless for a bit, and his spirit buoyed. Over time, he found increasing peace and a deepening trust in the divine presence, even as his practice of letting go included greater and greater losses. Brad believed the practice helped him to live well, in part because it helped him to die well. Not only did he bear the loss of strength and mobility, an especially terrible fate for a man who had been a star athlete, a local legend in football, basketball, and baseball. Not only did he surrender the joy of easy conversation, a treasured connection to his multitude of friends, Brad's practice helped him to let go of his innermost possessions, his expectations for his own life, and for his young children. Paradoxically, these losses gave way to a new sort of flourishing. He would tell me that he felt an increasing wholeness at the center of his being, even as his body failed. Now, this is not exactly what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel when he says, "Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." It is too small a thing to bearing our cross, to think of bearing our cross as bearing illness, even grave illness, the loss of paycheck or relationship, the dashed hopes we have for our children or ourselves. Those are hard things, but they are not the cross of Christ. The cross Jesus calls for is a matter of dying to a self-interested, self-centered, self-protective way of living, and in doing that to become more fully alive. It means trusting that our life means even more to God than it means to us. To trust that we are capable of depthless good, even in the seemingly least secure, most humiliating or powerless times of our lives. The cross is a call to servant leadership, to living a more authentic life, grounded in God's creative and empowering love. It is a willingness to suffer on behalf of others for the good of those in need. It's a matter of revealing God's sacrificial love and participating in the reconciling, healing work of Christ. And most of us find that opportunity within the circumstances of our daily life. Here at St. Paul's, we practice a variety of responses to Jesus' call to sacrificial living, to servant leadership. We see the hungry and we feed them. We notice the exhaustion of caregivers and we offer respite. We give of ourselves to shelter the homeless and tend the sick. We visit the lonely and imprisoned. We work for equality and justice. These are familiar and good ways of living for the sake of the gospel. Brad found another way, one that better fit his circumstances. When he could no longer get out in the world, he drew others into the sanctuary of his being, into that vaulted interior space, enlarged and illumined by hours of prayer. It wasn't just those of us who knew him who found an unlikely peace in his presence, but even more intentionally, Brad opened himself up to strangers he knew he would never meet. He chose to hold in prayer all those who suffered as he did, but who had never known the peace of Christ or the hope of faith. He held in his heart nameless others who were either too frightened, too sick, or too unaware of grace to hope. He took into his own body the brokenness of others and raised them up. It wasn't an easy prayer practice. It meant fully inhabiting his heavy wooden body, suffering all over again his own grief, disappointments, and fears. It meant being present to the physical, emotional, and spiritual pain that his faith had helped him transcend. The difference would be that he would do it with the consciousness of Christ crucified and risen. Jesus on the cross had absorbed into his being all the brokenness, judgment, humiliation, anguish, evil, and sin of the world. He suffered in solidarity with a suffering creation. In his resurrection, he overcame sin and death and raised us all to new life. Brad trusted that he was somehow participating in that same redemptive mystery, suffering on behalf of others. That was his cross to bear, not the loss of his own life, but the raising up of others. And the more he lifted that cross, the lighter he became. In the end, unable to move, Brad mobilized his friends. He considered them, considered all the various talents, and their love of good food and live music, and put together a community-wide party that raised a phenomenal amount of money. Not for Brad as his friends had originally intended, but for the benefit of all those strangers whom Brad had sheltered in his heart and prayer. Lent is a season of letting go, of dying to the self-centered habits and behaviors that diminish the soul. It's a time for taking on disciplines that draw us nearer to Christ and nearer to one another. It's a time for identifying the ways we are called to live abundantly and serve exuberantly. It's a time to explore ways to take up our cross and share in the redemptive work of Christ. For the sake of the neighbor who has lost hope, the stranger we may never meet, and for the joy of being fully alive. Amen.